Hello again from How to Write Science Fiction That Doesn't Suck. I'm Rick Partlow, and this is part 3 of our world building section. We started off with faster than light travel and how it affects your story. Then we went to weapons and combat. And now we're going to do future history. Future history is going to be a tricky thing. When I first wrote Duty on Our Planet, don't know if you've read that, but if you have, you know that part of the story involves what winds up happening with Russia and China in the future, and how the conflict between them in the future evolves into the current society that you wind up with in Duty on Our Planet. But I first started working on Duty on Our Planet when I was like a freshman or sophomore in college in the late 80s. Yes, I am very old. And at the time, the Soviet Union still existed. So the future history I wrote for Duty on Our Planet involved a resolution of the Cold War that turned out not to happen that way. So I had to go back and rewrite things later on. Well, you're going to find yourself in such situations sometimes if you write details into your future history that take place soon. If you are lucky enough to write a long series that hangs around for many years, you might find out that that's not the case. I've run into that just recently with one of my universes, the Birthright universe, has a throwaway line early in the universe, back in Birthright, the original trilogy, that says that Alpha Centauri didn't have planets because it's a two-star system, you know? And instead it had this huge asteroid belt that was mined and had like orbital colonies. But the problem is later on we found out that Alpha Centauri does have planets, and possibly habitable planets. I mean, they're at least the right size and place for them. So that, you know, my future history is counterfactual in that case. And what do you do when that happens? Well, you shrug and go on, because unless you want to go back and change everything you ever wrote about it, you're stuck with that. And since none of what you're writing is factual anyway, you can just take the mindset that it's an alternate history, an alternate universe. But getting back to writing future histories, I have seen a lot of future histories written, particularly, this is something that happened a lot back in the 80s, but I mean, it still happens, particularly in independent writers, you know, self-published writers, small press writers. They write future histories that are wishful thinking, I guess. I'm not speaking as just us surviving or getting into space, because that's pretty much a requirement for a science fiction novel, is we get into space. But I'm talking about like political situations, like they assume that their favorite political system is going to be the one that wins out. And I did not make that mistake. I mean, the Commonwealth government in the Birthright universe, it's not my favorite political system. It's pretty much a bureaucracy that's controlled by a huge corporate monolith. In a lot of ways, it's dystopian, but not really, because you don't have to live on Earth. So you can get away from it, get to the colony worlds, have a life, you know, of your own. But I think you have to take it, see, that's the thing. It sounds dystopian, but actually living in it, if you read the books where people live in it, it's not that bad, because the average guy, he has a pretty good life. It's only when you find out the things going on behind the scenes, you know, you pull back the curtain and see what's happening there, that you see how dirty everything is. But that's realistic. You know, you have a big government, any government pretty much larger than the size of a city, and even in a large city, probably the same way. You pull back the curtain, there's bad things going on back there. There's people doing bad things, making compromises they shouldn't, making deals they shouldn't. pretty much any large government is going to have corruption. And if you're writing a government that spans star systems, the corruption is going to be much, much more involved. They say absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, controlling multiple star systems and faster than light travel isn't absolute power, but it's a lot closer than anybody has had in the history of humanity. So that's one thing to take into account, that like the Federation, as drawn by Roddenberry, pretty much a nearly perfect system with a few weaknesses, but that's not a realistic government to have. You're going to have corruption. You're going to have systemic corruption. Things are going to get baked into the system that if any reasonable person looked from the outside, objectively would say, that's horrible, that's corrupt. But they're used to it. Just like our government. There's things that happen in our government that any reasonable person looking from the outside would say, that's really corrupt. But it's not even news anymore because it happens to everyone. Not to get political and not to name names or parties. But you have politicians who get elected as congressmen and their net worth is in the low 100,000s. And then all of a sudden, miraculously, they get a book deal that's worth 10 or 50 million. And then they work that 10 or 50 or $100 million into some sweetheart stock investments. And God knows how they knew exactly where to invest those stocks. And they become multimillionaires while they're politicians. So nobody says anything about that because that's the way things work. You don't have to find news stories about people who got sweetheart book deals or how they got that deal. Who gave them that deal? At what point in their career did they get that deal? Because that's how the government works. That's how deals are made. It's corrupt and it's dark, but it's the way things are, so much so that no one even reports on it anymore. And when you write your interstellar government, you have to keep in mind that dichotomy, that on the one side, it's going to be corrupt. There's going to be corruption. There isn't going to be any perfect Federation government like Star Trek. But on the other side, it's not going to be a nightmare. It's going to be just the way things are. And most people are going to live pretty, okay lives. Probably looking back at it from our point of view, with, their lives will be close to perfect, from what we see, because they won't want for anything. They'll have all the entertainment they want. If they want, they can go to a colony world, and start over. Just like the lives we live, as imperfect as they are and as much misery as we have, if you go to somebody who lived in the 1700s and showed them our lives, just the lives of the average guy, they would be, oh my God, that's like stepping into heaven. Because you have enough to eat, you have enough clothes to wear, you have a place to live. Most people have a car that can take them all the way across the country, and you can travel thousands and thousands of miles on roads. You can watch entertainment and educational materials. Every kid can go to school if he wants. Most of them can go to college, at least in a state college or community college. So to someone living in the 1700s, we're living in paradise. But to us, we say, oh man, this sucks. Well, in 2300 AD, we can look at how somebody's living and it seems perfect, but to them, they're like, this sucks. It could be so much better. That's humanity. So don't forget that dichotomy in your future history. When you write your world, it can't seem like paradise to the people who live in it. It has to show flaws to them. They have to see the corruption and the shortcomings. But you also have to keep in mind that just because it seems flawed to them, that you are also writing about a much higher technological civilization, probably post-scarcity. So the things that happen to people to make them think their lives suck or their system of government sucks, they have to be things that are unlike our own. yet that we can identify with. So corruption, everybody can identify with that, but it's going to take different forms. For instance, in Duty on a Planet, there's a problem with corruption where the people who control access to interstellar travel want to keep that control, and they basically conspire to invent threats that will keep their competitors from being able to get a hold in the market. So yeah, if you're one of these guys investing, trying to come up with your own transportation company in this government, and you aren't allowed to because of corruption by the corporate monopolies and the government, you're going to think that sucks and that everything's dystopian. But looking at their lives, where they can travel to the stars and nobody goes hungry, and it to us it would seem like paradise, but to them it's a dystopian corruption. So you need to keep that in mind. You need to try to balance that in your world building. Also, in your future histories, a few things to keep in mind. Now, this has exceptions, obviously. I mean, you can do whatever you want. But in my experience, reading other people's books and writing my own, try to avoid what they call black swan moments. That's the moment when everything changes. Now, black swan moments happen, but the problem is when they happen, they change every single bit of society. And if you're writing literary science fiction, that may be what you want. You want to have a black swan moment. You may want to examine how it affects every little bit of society and human interaction. Like the internet, rise of the internet to black swan moment. But what you are writing, if you're watching this, is genre science fiction, military science fiction, space opera. And your goal is not to make an accurate prediction of the effects of some unforeseeable technological development on humanity. Your goal is to write a kick-ass action story or military story with characters that the reader can identify with. Now, if you plopped somebody from the 21st century back into the aforementioned 1700s, nobody there would understand a word they're saying. I mean, not just that English has changed some since the 1700s, but their references. What's a car? Why would it be important to you that you have a good online reputation? Just the things that are important to us, they wouldn't understand. And that's realistic that we would not understand the mindset of somebody who actually lives in 2300 AD, but you're not writing a book for someone who lives in 2300 AD. You're not writing a book probably about someone who lives in our century trying to understand someone from them. Because if you were, then you could have an explanation and you wouldn't be just info dumping a story that nobody understands. You're trying to write a book that people now can relate to. So you don't want to be too futuristic. That seems kind of ironic given that we're writing science fiction, but certain things you can't be too groundbreaking in. You basically want the society that you're writing about to be recognizable to us. You want the mindset of the people in it to be recognizable to the readers, because the readers are the one who are going to make your story a success or a failure. If they can identify with your characters, then they're going to love them and they're going to come back and they're going to find your name and read the books you wrote. But if you write characters that are unidentifiable, unrelatable, just because you have gone so far inside the head of somebody who lives in 2300 AD and are trying to tell the story from their point of view, you may find that you've lost readers, that they don't relate to your character anymore. They want a character who's like them, who's dealing with different circumstances, but it's like them. For instance, that's why in a lot of my books, I make the characters from less developed places. Like Caleb Mitchell in Glory Boy, the Birthright trilogy, he was from a small, religiously based agricultural colony who is technologically simplistic on purpose. And then he's thrust into this high-tech Commonwealth, civilization that he did not grow up in. So you have the fish out of water, and he is more like us than he is like them. Cameron Alvarez in Drop Trooper, he is from the ruins of Tijuana, Mexico, which after the nuclear war that happens between Russia and China in my future history, and the collapse that follows it, most of civilization consolidates into these huge megacities, which leaves behind a lot of the old cities. Some of them, they bring the people in, but Tijuana and a couple other cities were left behind. They were destroyed in the collapse. Pretty much they didn't have a government, and there's nobody to help these people because everybody who was being brought into these cities was close by, like New York. New York collapses and burns in this future history, but they build this megacity right next door to it. Basically, capital city in that future history is built on what used to be Long Island. And the people who live there are brought from all around the Northeast. So there's hundreds of millions of people flooding into this megacity. And the closest one to Tijuana was too far away. It was Trans Angeles was, a long way away, and some of the people didn't want to leave, and the ones who were left behind, they made do with what they had left. They tried to rebuild, but it's basically a primitive city, a 20th century city, really, not even 21st, stuck in the 23rd century, and that's how the people live. So Cam Alvarez lived a simple life, and all the things that he was exposed to when he moved into, the high-tech civilization, that was new to him. So we're seeing things through the eyes of someone who is more like us than like these 23rd century people. And that's important. That's or 24th century people. That's important that you have a character, a point of view character, who can look at your world and show it to the reader from their point of view, or something close to their point of view. So when you're world building, try to avoid things that make your world unrecognizable, and then try to have a character who can look at your world from closer to our point of view. All right. When you write your future history, you need to make it, to recap, you need to make it not dystopian, not utopian, more realistic, but leaning towards what you might call a little bit on the negative side, just a little, because that's what happens when governments get larger. You need to not try to make the government like your dream ideal government, because that's not going to happen. You need to avoid black swan moments if you can, because it's going to be enough of a change. There's people having access to easy, cheap space travel, to interstellar travel, to colony worlds. That's going to be enough of a change. You don't need to also put in that something like everybody puts their consciousnesses into immortal androids, because that's a great way to lose the relatability of your characters. How can you relate to someone who's not afraid of getting hurt? If your soldiers are immortal androids and they go into battle and if they're destroyed, well, you can just pop out another copy and put your memories into it. How do you relate to those people? How do you relate to their loss and pain? You can't. I mean, it's a cool sounding story, and maybe it's fun to just look at the world, but you're not going to relate to the characters. And as I have said before, you need to have relatable characters. So try to avoid those kind of big consciousness changing technological advances. Maybe have them discussed. Maybe have a reason why it hasn't happened yet or might not happen, but don't do it. Don't do it for the civilization your main character's in. Maybe if they're fighting somebody else or they have an ally who's like that, then that's a cool side character or side story, but don't make your main character someone who is not relatable. Don't make them a guy in an immortal android body or a hive mind or something that nobody reading it in the 23rd century is going to be able to root for them, to understand their trials and tribulations. All right. Another thing with building future histories, remember who's reading your story, because it's very possible that things don't go our way and that the United States and Europe don't wind up leading the future march to the stars. Maybe it's China. Maybe it's somebody you wouldn't have expected. Maybe there's a League of African Nations that takes everybody to the stars. And that's cool, and that's a cool background of the story, but unless you have a really big international audience, then somebody reading the United States, reading about the Chinese taking to the stars, well, there's some really good books written from that perspective. The Three-Body Problem, for instance. But you're writing, probably, if you're listening to this, you're writing for the American market with maybe a little Canadian. You're writing in English. Unless you are wealthy enough or have access through a publisher to translations, most of the people who read your books are reading them in English. And you may think, well, that's a crass commercial, consideration when I'm trying to write a book. No, if you're doing this for a living, it's something to consider. And this series is about the craft of writing, but it's also how you write your book should tail into who's reading it. Now, if I was writing a book for an international market of non-English speakers, and I knew that, and I knew I was going to be translating, I would write differently. But I know, just because I know my market, that I'm writing for Americans, a few Canadians, some Australians, a little bit of a UK presence, but I'm writing in English for an English reading audience. I have a few readers in other countries, but they're all reading in English. And frankly, I'm writing from an American perspective. So that means my idiom is American. My slang is American. My turns of phrase are from an American point of view. So people who understand how Americans talk are going to enjoy my books more. And if you're listening to this and you're in America, you know what I'm talking about. So Canadians understand us. Australians understand us, to some extent. The British, we have a lot of different turns of phrase in the British, and I think that's why I don't do as well in the UK as I do in Canada. But if you're writing the point is, if you're writing for with an American voice, because you are American and that's your experience, then you know that your readers, the people who are going to find your writing compelling, are mostly going to be Americans. And they're all going to be English speakers, unless you've translated. So you might want to give them the perspective of someone in the future who is from an American-style government, in an American-style society. Now, that's not necessarily America. In none of my books is there a United States of America still existing on its own, in the future, except for Earth at War, which takes place in the near future. Not because America collapses, although in a couple of them they do, but because the governments kind of congeal into larger bodies as we have to deal with interstellar distances. and nations become less important when you're talking about conflicts between groups of solar systems. So in a couple of the universes, the United States government becomes like the leader, the predominant regional leader of the new government after the war, simply because China and Russia are gone. A lot of because in a couple of my future histories, they have a nuclear war. The reason I have China and Russia have a nuclear war is to avoid having to deal with the fact that there might be a Chinese-led government in the future, which I would have to, incorporate their culture and mindset into it. And frankly, I don't know that much about Chinese culture, and I doubt I will be able to find out enough to be able to write something from inside the head of someone who was raised in Chinese culture. If you were raised in Chinese culture, you might want to try that style of future history where they are the leaders. Even if you're an American citizen, if you're raised in China, or you have family who's raised in China, maybe you're up to that task of writing a book that takes place in a future where China is one of the leaders in a new, interstellar government. I'm not. I know American society. I know Canadian society. I can get close enough to understand Australians and English people, and to some extent Europeans, although not all of them. But China is it's a different country with different social norms, and I'm not going to pretend to know enough to write a character who was raised in that society. Has nothing to do with cultural appropriation. It has to do with me just not knowing enough about it, and what I wrote would sound fake. I don't want to sound fake, and I don't want you to sound fake either. So keep that in mind when you write your future history and you base your government and your society on a current one that survives through to become one of the preeminent interstellar powers, then you need to try to make it one you can write from their point of view and not sound fake. Now, you may be writing so far in the future that you think that's not important, and yet it is, because you're still writing from your point of view. So if you're writing in a society that is totally different from your own, even if it's one you created, it's going to sound like American society. Your reaction to it, your character's voice is going to sound American if you're American. So if you're listening to this, the likelihood is you are American or Canadian, possibly Australian, and a few from the UK, I know. So you're going to be writing this from your perspective, which means the characters are going to be, whether you like it or not, unless you have firsthand experience for years being raised and living in another society, you're basically going to have a voice that sounds like you're from where you are. And you can't avoid that, really. You can try to make your character react differently based on their experiences, but you're going to have a voice that sounds like you're from where you are, which is why you should consider, when you make your future society, what it's based on. And you can't make it too different from what we have now, or else the voice of your character is not going to sound genuine. Okay, so future histories should have a jumping off point somewhere not too far in the future. There should be something that happens soon, not very soon, not like in the next 10 years, because you don't want to overwrite your own writing. You don't want to have current events contradict you like happened to me. But you should have a jumping off point, a point of departure, as they say in alternate history novels, that's not too far ahead, maybe 50 years, so that what winds up developing from that has a relation to what's happening now. Like the Sino-Russian nuclear war that happens in the Duty on Our Planet universe and also in the Birthright universe, it's perpetually like 30 years away. I mean, the longer I live, the longer I write, it gets 30 years away from now instead of 30 years away from 1990 or 2000. But it's perpetually 25 or 30 years away. So that's where you should start. Is if you just, the reason I say that is, if you just assume that things are going to go the way that they have been, and I don't want to sound too depressing here, but the way things are going, if they keep going the way they're going, we're never going to get into the stars. Because one, United States is pretty much the leader in space exploration and space exploitation. And we keep running into the problem of one administration will say we're going to the moon in 10 years, and then that president loses the election, or the next president of his party loses the election after he's had 2 terms. And the next, the other party says, oh, we've got too many problems here on Earth. We're not going to the moon, or this isn't realistic, or we're not going to do it this way. And then we change our priorities. So the only thing that will get us to the stars, the way things are going realistically, is private enterprise. And even that could be hamstrung by government. So I find it useful to have a point of departure somewhere in the near future where things change. Not a technological point of departure, not like a black swan moment, but something big happens, like an asteroid hits the Earth, and cause, not big enough to destroy the Earth or destroy civilization, but like a rock that's big enough to destroy a city. Something that wakes people up. A nuclear war happens and we're forced to try to get resources from elsewhere to survive. The asteroid hits a city and destroys it, and we're like, we'd better get out there and get involved, or this is going to be our future, just waiting for something to smack us. Aliens come, and we deal with the knowledge that we're not alone, or an alien signal comes. Something big happens that focuses the powers that be on getting off Earth. Now, maybe I'm too negative. Maybe things will work out and we will have an interstellar civilization anyway, despite what things look like right now. But I think it would be easier to justify an interstellar civilization that happens in a reasonable amount of time, like 300 or 400 years instead of 10,000, if you have something big happen that makes us focus on it. So that's something to consider, because if you look at it just from a practical point of view, if things just go the way they've been going, there's not a lot of reason to have colonies off Earth. I mean, you have outposts. I mean, we're going to go to Mars eventually. They'll put people there just for the heck of it. There'll be a moon base. But a colony is expensive and takes a lot of time and effort and human lives and money. And there has to be a good reason for it. And if you can't come up with a good reason that is like intertwined with your future history, then your story's not going to sound realistic. So one thing that's important about your future history is to have a reason why we leave Earth. And this is for space opera, this is for military science fiction, this is for literary science fiction. If you're going to write novels that take place off Earth on colonies or settlements, you have to come up with a good reason why we went there. Because, I deal with that somewhat in Duty on Our Planet and Birthright, where people acknowledge that the only reason that we've colonized these worlds around other planets is because we could, and we had a compulsion to get off Earth to spread humanity around that came because of our history, and we pushed these colonies out here, and it doesn't make economic sense. But once they exist, and then it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle, and we do it because they're there. You know, there's trade between interstellar colonies, not because Earth needs it, but because it was established and it's become a habit. And people acknowledge this in the books that this all is running on a razor thin edge, and it could collapse at any time, and it does in one of them. So that's something else you have to acknowledge in your books, that a lot of what happens in economic systems and political systems is not based on logic or reason or cause and effect. It's based on just things that get into place, and they're there, and they have a bureaucratic inertia to them. And maybe it doesn't make any sense that Earth concerns itself with the politics of one of its colonies. Why should they care? And yet they do, because they always have. And you don't get people to change things just by pointing out this doesn't make any sense. I mean, look at our current world. You know, there's a lot of things that don't make sense, but they happen because they've always happened. And that same thing is going to be true in the future. So just to recap what we've gone through today, your future histories, try to avoid black swan events, try to keep your future civilization identifiable to the reader, which means probably if you are an English writer, somebody's writing in English, probably keeping it recognizable and in the voice of somebody from today is going to make you have a future history where Europe and the United States are still important in it. Whether you think that's going to happen or not, just because you're writing with the voice of somebody who's in the United States or Canada or the UK or somewhere that speaks English, if you're listening to this in English. You might want to, if you want to keep things realistic, have some event happen that gets people off Earth, gets them more focused, so that you can justify having an interstellar civilization within the next few centuries rather than thousands or tens of thousands of years in the future, which will make it easier for you to keep your civilization identifiable to a current reader. All right, that's it for today. I will try to get another video out to you next week if I can think of a good topic for one. And if you want to contact me, as always, dutyhonorplanet487@gmail.com, rickpartlow.com, or facebook.com/dutyhonorplanet. If you're interested in finding my books, go to amazon.com, look up Rick Partlow. I am the only Rick Partlow who is a writer that I could tell. There's only one other Rick Partlow that comes up when you Google in the first couple pages, and he's a B actor and Foley artist. So you're not going to confuse me with anybody else. And thanks for listening. Like and subscribe. If you know anybody else who's into writing, tell your friends, tell them to check out my videos, and I will talk to you next time.